Thank you very much. We are joined now by talk show host Tim Modise to chat about the passing of Kofi Anan. Tim, he's been heralded as an African inspiration, a son of Africa who led the world and made incredible strides, not only for global peace and humanitarian causes, but especially for the plight of Africans. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, most definitely, and thanks for inviting me. I think Kofi Annan was remarkable in that sense that it is the position of Secretary General of the United Nations is one of the foremost political positions in the world. We had not heard much about him prior to that, except as the director for the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations. But when he ascended the position of United Nations Secretary General, many people around the world felt that Africa's voice was going to be heard and was going to become very influential within the United Nations security system. But of course, within a short time, we all learned that that was not necessarily going to be, even though Kofi Annan discharged his responsibilities accordingly. And the main thing that happened then was the war against Iraq and the way it was put together by the United States government and their allies. And part of that was because the United Nations Security Council is a body made up of those 5 permanent members. If amongst themselves they agree whatever needs to happen, that will happen. But Kofi Annan worked very hard to try and avert that war, and he failed. Yes. So that was when everybody realized that the power of the United Nations Secretary General can only go so far.
Can only go so far. Yeah. I know I read a quote earlier today where someone had challenged him during a discussion and said, well, what is his response to having failed to change the situation after 5 months when God created the world in just 7 days? And his response was, well, the Lord had the privilege, the unique privilege of having to work alone.
Yes.
So obviously, returning to what you said, they're very difficult to effect change when you've got so much at play and working with so many different countries, different powers with their own agendas.
Absolutely, but for him to win the confidence of leaders around the world who hold different views to one another, and even where tensions exist or existed, for him to be able to calm those tensions down, I think says a lot about his abilities as a diplomat. And it is clear from all the interviews we've seen and the speeches he's given that his personality was actually the most influential thing about himself. Very humble, very modest and knowledgeable, reasonable, not extreme in his views, very moderate in advancing the cause of peace generally in the world. So there are no particular blunders that one can point to and say these were Kofi Annan's specific or specifically induced blunders. But he tried his best with limited power because, the Secretary General of the UN can only do so much. They don't really control anything. Yeah. They just herd everybody together.
And having been in service for 40 years, surely that also says something in his testament to the fact that all the people around him and his colleagues and the people within the United Nations must have held a great level of confidence in his ability to lead them.
Absolutely. And one other thing that comes to mind is because of his standing and the way he conducted himself on the public stage as a global leader, that earned him the stripes and influence enough to go and talk to other African leaders who were dealing with their own, let's call them domestic problems, or regional problems. Yeah. When you think of South Sudan, for instance, a person like him could facilitate a meeting there. When we look at the conflict in the DRC, a person like him could help facilitate deliberations and discussions there. The situation in Kenya, many Kenyans remember him for averting what was likely to become a civil war there. And of course, enjoying the ear of leaders like Nelson Mandela here and going on to set up the Committee of Elders, the Council of Elders. That says a lot about him. And of course, a very good friend of South Africa who was here recently.
And very recently, his involvement in the elections in Zimbabwe, which have been very iconic elections for the first time after Robert Mugabe stepping down, that peaceful elections, free and fair elections were very, very hot topic. I know we reported quite extensively on that. And that his involvement there and his participation and his voice adding to those discussions quite prominently as well.
Absolutely, because he was, a trusted voice, never took sides in an obvious manner, except for a positive outcome on the side of the people. I suppose the experience in the human rights arena was the most dominant thing from the way he sorted out problems. I think ultimately the whole point was, can you create a win-win situation for the benefit of a particular people, a particular nation? And I would think that that was the same mindset when he went to Zimbabwe.
Yeah. I want to go back a little bit as well and talk about Syria, because he resigned from that peacekeeping mission, stating that he thought that the different agendas, the situation there, he felt he was unable to try and broker a peace deal. And ultimately, the parties in Syria, the government there, the rebel situation, do you think people would reflect on that particular part of his history as having been a failing? Surely no one is perfect. Even after they pass away, we tend to build people up as and celebrate their victories. But, surely also people's failings, and when they recognize their failings, make them far more human and accessible.
Well, I think the thing we need to remember about the Middle East is that it's a very, very complex area, very intractable issues there for decades. And the history of how some of the countries came into being in the Middle East is always instructive to go back to who did what when. And those old grudges have not been resolved. And of course, the outcome or the aftermath of the Cold War, the geopolitics, all of those things play a considerable role, and who's allied with who is also something that influences the developments in the Middle East, as well as the outcomes of elections in the United States. Whoever is president at that time is likely to direct the course of events in the Middle East. So I wouldn't blame him for failing at all. And you just look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation to understand, to appreciate how difficult it is to solve the problems there. You look at Yemen now, with the United Nations itself and the Secretary General and whoever else is there. They are failing, they're battling, but it's very, very difficult. So ultimately, I wouldn't blame him for that. I'm sure there are parts of his career that people will comment on and say, he failed here, he failed there. I think, for instance, in the case of Rwanda, he's likely to be very much criticized for that. But I think one thing we should remember, he was not the cause of the war. The challenge would be, he did not provide enough early warning system. He did not apply enough pressure on the United States. But all of the major nations of the world were there. They witnessed what happened, and they took long to respond to the Rwandan situation. But I think Rwanda would be one where he is seen to have come seriously short.
I wanted to return to the confluence of his passing with other events today. So we saw Deputy President David Mabuza speaking at Ellis Park at a national prayer meeting. And that meeting had the focus of trying to bring about moral regeneration. So it's very sad, especially today, that on such a day when we are talking about morality or the lack thereof in South Africa, that we should lose an African icon who stood for those very principles.
Well, I suppose people like Kofi Anan, for me, once they've done their work, we celebrate their legacy and we look up to them as benchmarks of leadership. So, looking at it from as much as he's no more with us now, from his point of view, I think those who are close to him should take comfort in the fact that he served well, and he played a very huge role on the global stage, did his best, and dispelled all the stereotypical views that people may have of African leaders, that, hey, we've got Kofi Anan, he's not your typical despot, dictator type person who's greedy and oppressive and is prone to warmongering and stuff like that, that he wasn't like that. And therefore, any leader who's lived in the times of Kofi Anan and followed what he did and what he's all about should regard him as a benchmark. I don't expect personally to see people of his age continuing to do the work when the younger people who grew up and observed what people like Kofi Anan contributed learn from those and then take the struggle forward to make sure that they improve the living conditions of their nations.
I want to pick up on what you've said about African leaders in particular, those sort of stereotypical ideas of African despot leaders. Yet when we look at leadership globally, there's a lot lacking. It's not just African leaders. There seems to be a general vacuous black hole in terms of leadership, and perhaps that's because the people on the ground are in need of so much more leadership, or look up to people in so many different ways.
Sure. I think it's the promise of globalization at a certain point and the coming apart of the same globalization, if you will, because certain countries have put or have more influence on the economies of other countries, and that has led to nationalistic tendencies rising within those nations, and then leaders within those particular countries latching onto the rising extreme nationalistic views. And on the basis of that, then those nations tend to create an enemy where none may exist. But I think they're also characterized by internal dissent within themselves, where there's some conflict going on. But in order for the leaders of those respective countries to become relevant, to get elected, they come with extreme nationalistic positions, sometimes very populist, but that will not succeed in this era of globalization. But the support for them is understandable, because people would have lost jobs, the coming apart of the financial system 10 years ago, which led to hardships being experienced by a lot of people. So, you know, and the rise of social media on top of that. Yes. So the world is going through another era, I think, a sort of revision of the free liberalization of the global economy at a certain point, and the effects thereof, and how different groups or nations responded to them, and local politicians took advantage of that sentiment. And of course, the motivation, you know, in their personal capacities. What is it that made them want to lead those nations? What did they do? Did they take the opportunity? Do they take the opportunity to advance their nations? Or do they take the opportunity to try their ideologies? Or do they take the opportunity to enrich themselves? So many of those attempts have been a disappointment already in some parts of the world, as we see with what's going on in Nicaragua, as we see with what's going on in Venezuela, for instance.
Thank you very much for your commentary and analysis always. Tim Modise from the Modise Network, chatting to us about the passing of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan.